Infrastructure spreading like roots beneath foreign soil, cargo ships slicing through tar-black oceans, a handshake stretched just far enough to tighten into a chokehold. Death Stranding 2 isn't rebuilding connections anymore, it's exporting them, reshaping its message into a colonial conquest where digital unity becomes domination. The chiral network, once a promise of renewal, now exposes the thin line between bridging communities and binding them. Where the first game had the wholesome message of reconnecting an ever-isolating America and rebuilding the infrastructure that forged society and the need for physical goods and connections, On the Beach deliberately asks a far more disturbed question in its tagline: should we have connected? Because the premise of the second game is far more disturbed, at least on a subtextual level. The main quest is about expanding the chiral network into Australia and incorporating it into the UCA system. This is, for all intents and purposes, digital colonialism. To the game's credit, it recognises this. In fact, it's the whole reason Sam and the Magellan crew are sent in place of an expedition, so that the UCA doesn't appear hostile and approach with an overwhelming force to integrate Australia into their system. But it doesn't so much matter who does the expansion when the end result is the same. Australia becomes a sub-colony of America who becomes entirely dependent on their new benefactor. See, the reason this is digital colonialism is because America has a monopoly on the internet. They created it, they control it, and they distribute it. Now, I hope I don't need to tell you why one country controlling the most important invention in human history is an extremely bad thing, as I've deliberately referred to it as America instead of the UCA because I believe it illustrates my point better. America giving Australia access to the chiral network is a dangerous prospect, as they're controlling the country's every resource. As America certainly isn't going to give Australia any access to their servers, or perhaps any insight into how they achieved this miracle system. What's more, as they'll have complete control over another nation's internet, they'll certainly be able to monitor any and all discussion and able to quash any dissent before it even begins. And what happens if Australia and America do get into a fundamental disagreement? Well, America will simply shut off the power supply and render them helpless until they once again bend the knee. And then there's the frightening discovery that fully connecting Australia will lead to another plate gate opening, and then America is off to conquer another continent. Now, as a European New Zealander, the irony of Australia getting colonised is certainly not lost on me, and I'm probably the last person who should be making this point. But someone that absolutely should is Sam and Fragile, because the core premise of On the Beach goes frighteningly unaddressed by our protagonists. Now, granted, they all have a lot more on their mind, but it strikes me as odd they don't connect with the fact they're literally paving the road for a global American empire, which serves as a disconnect for me as one of the game's core themes, as Kojima deemed it important enough for it to be the tagline. The dangers of hyperconnectivity was the logical place to go after the wholesome nature of the internet portrayed in the first game, yet the main narrative focuses much more on themes of grief and loss, rather than the perils and weight of the Magellan crew's actions. In fact, speaking of the Magellan, its namesake Ferdinand Magellan was the man who laid the foundation for colonialism by discovering the Strait of Magellan that allowed for easier travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Which is similar to what the DHV Magellan does. It's not the colonists themselves, but it's the one laying the groundwork for the Americans to come in and form the ruling class. What's more, the sequel's expanded focus on combat encounters compound with this new murkier motivation Sam has. The brigands in Australia aren't given as much depth as the mules were in the first game. In fact, they may just be desperate people who formed communities with nowhere else to go and are forced to scrounge off the scraps of society just to get by. Essentially, they may be the local inhabitants of Australia who were at peace before America came and upset everything. And now with Sam, we have a far more expansive arsenal that we turn on them in order to steal their land and plant a footprint in their territory, and I'm a little perplexed as to why Sam doesn't understand this. Now, this is a result of one of my major criticisms of Death Stranding 2 and cementing the first game as my preferred installment. Where everything in the first game somehow tied back into the themes of connection, the sequel has split its message too much juggling grief, connections, AI, identity, and vengeance, which leads to a much muddier narrative. That's not to say it's bad. It has excellent performances and the wonderfully weird balance between serious and silly that Kojima is known for, but this darker premise of colonialism isn't given as much attention by its characters as I feel it should, and I feel like it was a missed opportunity to not further explore this new moral complexity. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video comparing Death Stranding with Clear Obscure and how both portray isolation.